All right, so welcome to Rembrandt or Not, the CRMA's intriguing etchings. All right, so Rembrandt, as I'm sure we're all somewhat aware, was a prolific painter, draftsman, and etcher who's usually regarded as the greatest artist of Holland's golden age, which was in the 17th century. He was born in 1606 and worked first in his native Leiden, and from 1632 onwards, he worked out of Amsterdam, where he studied briefly with the influential history painter Peter Lastman. This was around 1624. So Rembrandt never went abroad, but he was a voracious student of the work of other Northern artists who had lived in Italy, many of whom worked in the style of Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, as seen here. Caravaggio's distinctive style was tenebrism. Both of these paintings are an excellent example of that. And tenebrism is using extreme lights and darks to create emotional impact. The Utrecht painter, Gerrit van Honthorst, was Rembrandt's main link to Caravaggio. Honthorst was one of what is called the Caravaggisti, or the other painters who worked in Caravaggio's distinctive style. Rembrandt also saw the works of German painter Adam Elsheimer, though Rembrandt was most familiar with Elsheimer's work through prints as opposed to paintings. He also studied the work of his teacher Lastman, seen here in the middle, and Flemish painters Anthony van Dyck, seen on the left, and on the right, and Peter Paul Rubens, seen on the left. And those painters worked in slightly less dramatically lit styles, but still very Baroque. If you look at all three of these paintings, you can see they're really expressive diagonal lines, which is something very typical of Baroque art. And so Rembrandt saw all of these and was very interested in how other artists were working. In his Leiden period, Rembrandt also saw the work of earlier Netherlandish artists such as Lucas van Leyden, whose work is seen here. A crucial aspect of his development was his intense study of the natural world. So Rembrandt studied people, objects, their surroundings, and we can see this really intensive study from nature in early works like his St. Paul in Prison from 1627. So even by Dutch standards, and Dutch artists were known for their observation of the natural world. If you'll recall, there are a lot of Dutch still lifes from this period that are very true to life. So Dutch artists were known for studying the natural world, but even by this standard, Rembrandt's preoccupation with direct observation was unusual and continued throughout his career. His really compelling descriptions of light, space, atmosphere, modeling, and texture can really be traced back to the years that he spent in Leiden, the early years of his career. And it was also this habit of direct observation that made him a really great teacher. And a lot of kind of the second generation artists from the Dutch Golden Age studied with Rembrandt. And here are some of their works here. He worked with Gerrit Douw, Govert Flinck, Ferdinand Bol, Nicolas Mays, and Karel Fabricius. If you're familiar with Donna Tartt's book, The Goldfinch, that is a painting by Karel Fabricius that graces its cover and is a major player in the plot, which has always been one of my favorites. So once he moved to Amsterdam, Rembrandt became known as a really prominent portraitist, and he attracted the attention with dramatic compositions like the one we see here, which is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp from 1632. When he was securing commissions, the artist was assisted by the Mennonite art dealer Hendrik Uhlenberg, whose cousin Saskia Rembrandt married in 1634 and was the great love of his life. The Mennonites advocated a really personal interpretation of scripture, which probably influenced Rembrandt's moving and very emotional treatment of biblical subjects. Rembrandt became really highly successful in the 1630s when he had several pupils, assistants, started his own art collection, and was really living the life of a cultivated gentleman, especially in the very impressive home he purchased in 1639, which is now the Rembrandt House Museum. Rembrandt really exudes confidence and urbanity in his self-portrait from 1641 of, as you probably know, many that he made throughout his career. This self-portrait was modeled upon courtly portraits by Renaissance artists like Raphael and Titian. And these mononymic artists probably also inspired his Amsterdam signature on paintings when he dropped his last name of Van Rijn and started just signing his paintings with Rembrandt. So although he is best known as a painter, Rembrandt was also a really voracious printmaker. Between 1626 and 1665, he created some 300 etchings and dry points. So in etching, a waxy ground is applied to a copper plate. The artist scratches into this ground with an etching needle, revealing the copper below. Acid is then used to burn those lines directly into the plate. After the waxy ground is removed and the ink is applied to the plate that fills those incised lines, it's printed onto paper. So etching became a really popular method for artists during this period because the way the needle bit into the copper, it really closely resembled drawing. So it was a very natural way for artists to create prints. Rembrandt also worked in dry point, which is a technique that made marks directly into the copper plate. And dry point creates really rich, dark, velvety lines because there's a little burr from a little fuzziness resulting from the metal burr that's made in the copper. So dry point can have some really beautiful, deep, dark lines. So Rembrandt's career as a printmaker ran parallel to his career as a painter, and he rarely treated the same themes in both media. Only occasionally does he reproduce his paintings and prints. He really doesn't do that a lot and moves away from it quickly. Above all, he was a great innovator and experimenter in printmaking, and his impact on the field is still reflected in etchings produced today. So here we see a really early piece. He began etching while he was still in Leiden in the 1620s. Not surprisingly, for those who know Rembrandt, he used his own face very commonly in his early prints, which were probably meant as studies of varied expressions rather than self-portraits. This is obviously not him. Like many artists who are just starting out in a new medium, he worked with the people around him. And so this is his mother from an early 1620 print. And we can really see his amazing use of line present even here, and his use of light and dark. Once he moved to Amsterdam, he tried his hand at creating larger, more highly finished prints that were related to his paintings. So here we see his print of the Good Samaritan paired with his painting of the same subject. So it is essentially the same scene, but like all prints, you know, he etched this into the copper plate exactly how he painted it, but when it was printed, the image is flopped. But as I said, he moves away from this pretty quickly. He really gets away from formal and polished printmaking that was more than other things meant to publicize a painter's work. So most of the prints from his mature period are pretty small and sketchy. This is perhaps his most famous print. This is the 100 Gilder print, which he worked on in stages throughout the 1640s, and was really the critical work in the middle of his career, and where we see his final etching style really begin to emerge. So in the 100 Gilder print, Rembrandt is weaving together individual episodes from the Gospel of St. Matthew to illustrate its full chapter 19. It's a really exquisite puzzle of darks and lights that draw the eye across the image. The print only survives in 2 states, the first of which is quite rare. There's evidence of a lot of reworking that can be seen underneath the final print. So he was working on that copper plate, trying out new things, discarding others, and really, you know, kind of futzing with the print for a long time. The title, the 100 Gilder print, refers to an early story about this, that Rembrandt paid 100 guilders to buy back an impression of this print. While the tale itself is dubious, it does suggest that this print had become rare during Rembrandt's own lifetime. Rembrandt was fascinated with subjects from the Bible, as in Abraham and Isaac, which we can see here on the left. He really enjoyed revealing the human emotion and narrative detail inspired by biblical stories. Landscapes, interestingly, were another favorite print subject. Interesting because his paintings are never landscapes. Like, he very rarely does something that's not a portrait or a biblical scene. So landscapes are almost non-existent in his painted oeuvre, but they're very present in his prints. This is the three trees, excuse me, which we see here on the right. So we can see he's evoking the typically blustery and rainy Dutch weather. And this is maybe the most dramatic of his landscape works. He did landscapes at 2 different moments in his print career, one group in the 1640s, another in the 1650s. And in the 1650s, he reprinted a lot of the prints from the earlier group. Many of his landscapes, for instance, clump of trees with a vista seen here, almost appear to have been created outside in nature, although in most cases he composed them in his studio from drawings that he made around the countryside of Amsterdam. Rembrandt, as I said, had a large art collection. He owned a lot of prints from earlier masters like Albrecht Dürer, Lucas van Leyden, Raphael, Andrea Mantegna, Antonio Tempesta. He often draws inspiration from the work of other printmakers. This can be seen in things like his Beggar Leaning on a Stick. Rembrandt's is on the left here, where he probably created this on the model of Frenchman Jacques Caillots' series of etchings of beggars from 1620 to 1633. We have a number of Caillots etchings in our collection at the CRMA. I've used a number of them in previous exhibitions, and they are really lovely. But later in his life, Rembrandt really suffers a reversal of financial fortune, and he has to sell his print collection for financial reasons. So by the 1650s, Rembrandt began treating the printing plate a lot like a canvas, leaving some ink or tone on the surface in order to create painted impressions of prints, where each impression looked markedly different, depending on the way he had inked the plate. So here we see two different versions of his work, The Entombment from 1654. In the first state, we see on the left, totally without plate tone, so only the etched lines are visible. The second state on the right, he produces this really subtle, moody impression of the same image by leaving a lot of ink on the surface of the printing plate and then wiping it away in certain areas to create highlights. So we can see here, he's picked out the body of Christ and a few of the figures around him. This is the reclining female nude from 1658. And here he's combined layers of etching and dry point line with a lot of plate tone. So again, we get a very moody, mysterious type of print. He also experimented with the differing effects that could be obtained by printing on various types of papers and other supports. He printed the impression of the second state of the three crosses, as seen here on vellum, a surface that brings a really warm overall tone to the image and emphasizes these really rich darks that he creates. Rembrandt often dramatically reworked his late prints, creating almost entirely new visions of the same subject in each state. Since he preserved so many states of his working process, present-day viewers can really bear witness to the differences and the changes that he made. So as the plate of, go back to it for the moment, as the plate of the three crosses was wearing down, Rembrandt chose to create a very different version of the scene in a fourth state. So he scraped away and polished away large portions of the foreground and added new figures and emphatic hatching. He shifted the moment in the story and created an even more dark and dramatic biblical representation. He also did some dramatic reworking on this print, which is Christ presented to the people. This is another print that he did largely in dry point. So you can see a little fuzzy burr to the lines in this one. So he erased, as we can see between these two sections, in the later one on the right, he erases that entire foreground group. He gets rid of all of those characters so that there's nothing really between the viewer and the figure of Christ coming out and presenting him. In the 1650s, when he was doing this, Rembrandt had avid fans of his prints as far south as Italy, and they collected many states and varied impressions of these remarkable works. Before modern times, when images really saturated the marketplace, today we are awash in images from every direction. Earlier eras valued prints for a variety of reasons. Before there was photography, people relied on prints simply to know how things looked. This was a really early way to propagate information and to, share information widely. So there are scientific illustrations like we see here on the left from Mary Sibylla Miriam, medical illustrations from Andreas Vesalius, but prints were the only way really to get information widely disseminated. And so people understood what things looked like and could really see what they were talking about. So these are repositories of scientific, technical, and historical knowledge, as well as objects of visual pleasure. So Rembrandt's prints are beautiful for a number of reasons, not the least of which are the intense humanity with which he renders his subjects and his really deeply personal vision of the Bible from the point of view of a believing Christian. This is his print of the prodigal son. He's so good at getting emotion communicated in these lines. He was really famous during his lifetime for deploying light and shade into finer and finer nuances. The resulting shimmering quality, which is a word that's often used to describe his prints, suggests the changing moods of his subjects. His great discovery, as one writer put it, was that the motion of light through a space and across human features can express emotion and the changing states of the psyche. In the prints made during Rembrandt's lifetime, his technical virtuosity in the use of light is easily apparent. The dark areas have a really rich depth and weight that draws the viewer into the picture, while the lighter areas have almost a magical transparency. Rembrandt issued prints in various states with sometimes very small modifications. They weren't all, I'll go back, they weren't all as dramatic as this. So he would issue prints in different states with very slight variations to them. He had already discovered the kind of collector-based marketing that today enables music companies to sell us the same music over and over by adding an extra track or a remix or something. The first Rembrandt etchings were pulled by Rembrandt himself. And even if not all the lifetime impressions were hand printed by Rembrandt, a lifetime proof will be of far greater value than a posthumous one or one pulled after his death. Because the thing about working in prints, of course, is that they can still be pulled after you're gone. Like the plate still exists, so the art can be made even though the artist has passed on. With posthumous impressions, of course, the water gets a little bit murkier. It's not necessarily so that the earliest posthumous prints from Rembrandt copper plates are the best, nor that what is printed in them is entirely Rembrandt's. So copper, which is what he made etchings on, it's a really soft metal, which makes it ideal for etching and dry point, but that softness also means that copper plates wear away really quickly. So at various times, engravers, often ones who were highly skilled, tried to improve degraded Rembrandt plates. So if a plate was worn down and wasn't printing very well, these engravers would go in with their own hand and try to retouch these plates. And of course, this just takes the image further and further away from the touch of Rembrandt's own hand, because you're going in, you're widening the lines, and you're making something darker, and you're taking away from the delicacy of the original tone. So thankfully, the mid-19th century put somewhat of a stop to this with the invention of a process known as steel facing. And this is where a copper plate is given a thin coating of steel by electrotyping. And so this steel face doesn't damage the plate and it can be removed, but it also prevents any further wear. Although obviously it could not undo any wear that was already received or remove the traces of previous restorers. So a bit of an imperfect solution, but a solution nevertheless. Interest in Rembrandt's prints really began at the time, before the time of his death, and continues to the present day. There's still a very hot market for Rembrandt prints. After his death, a number of his printing plates were in the hands of print seller and friend Clement de Younga, seen here, and another dealer named P. Mariette, who was a print collector as well. Over the years, numerous owners of the plates have printed posthumous impressions from them. Some were really faithful prints. The plates had held up pretty well. Still display the subtlety of line and tone evident in Rembrandt's lifetime impressions. Well, some of the plates degraded a little further, and the more prints you're making on a plate, the more the plate is going to degrade. So we're getting further and further away from Rembrandt's own hand. Pardon me. So when dealers would recut or re-etch the plates, the resulting works were usually described as reworked or retouched. And this kind of happens from the mid-18th century on. In the 19th century, there were 3 companies that were engaged in reproductive etchings based on original Rembrandt prints. So instead of working from the copper plates, which were compromised in this scenario, these galleries are going back to his original prints that were made during his lifetime. And they were basing these reproductive etchings on photo engravings of those original prints. So they're kind of skipping over these damaged copper plates that existed, making a print directly from one of Rembrandt's original prints, and then going from that. So these are industrial photo engravings, possibly with some detailing by dry point rather than handmade prints. Because they were created by reproducing original Rembrandt etchings, they're often offered for sale, probably sometimes not malicious, probably not knowingly sometimes, sometimes definitely knowingly. So they're sometimes offered for sale as original Rembrandt etchings, which they definitely are not. They're very desirable, they can be very lovely, but they are not original etchings. Prints by the Berlin Reichsdruckerei, while printed in Germany, were actually published in England. And there were 3 companies that did this. It was Armand Durand, the Autotype Company, and the Berlin Reichsdruckerei that I just mentioned. So the prints in our collection that are on darker brown paper are probably from this series that was printed by the Reichsdruckerei in England from 1889 to 1900. They're probably from this series, as the watermark on the paper does not appear in any of the listings of Rembrandt's lifetime watermarks. So it's from that we've kind of determined that these Rembrandt prints in our collection are not lifetime ones. They are what's known as these 19th century restrikes. And so here was really the crux of why we didn't end up putting them in the 125 Masterworks show, because they're really cool and they're really beautiful. And I go through them all in just a moment, but they're not, you know, they're not 17th century Rembrandt prints. And we've done an exhibition of them before and they're absolutely lovely, but with print work, the question of authenticity and originality gets very thorny. And so we just thought for 125 Masterworks, we were going to leave them out, but we thought it was a great opportunity to have this exact talk and discuss exactly why. So not surprisingly, there's also a really big price difference between lifetime prints from Rembrandt and these 19th century restrikes. And for most people, this doesn't matter. Like if you're interested in owning a Rembrandt print, owning a 19th century restrike is a much more affordable way to do it. And truly with one of those, you know, you're getting the real look of Rembrandt and you're getting the feel of his work. It's certainly better than if you had like an 18th century one that had been made from a denuded copper plate and wouldn't have the real look or feel of Rembrandt to it. So aesthetically speaking, they're really flawless. There's just the industrial element that puts off some people, you know, that want the true etching feel of a Rembrandt. But, you know, for a bargain shopper who's after a Rembrandt, and I say bargain, they still run around, you know, a couple $1,000s each. So it's not like we're going to go pick one up at the grocery store. But certainly in the canon of Rembrandt prints, they are the more affordable option. So to end, I just want to take us through the prints that are in the CRMA's collection. Although they are not in our 125 Masterworks, they're really important art history artifacts and beautiful in their own right. So to begin, I'm going in chronological order here. This is an elderly woman. This is Rembrandt's mother seated at a table from 1631. And as I said earlier, Rembrandt featured his mother in some of the earliest etchings that he made. Her name was Nieltje Willemsdier van Zoutbroek, which is probably the last time I should ever try to pronounce a Dutch name. In two versions that he made around 1630, she is 60 years old. These are really accurate studies. We've got her furrowed face drawn in such detail. You can imagine young Rembrandt toiling away on his copper plate in front of her. The Persian from 1632. In the 18th century, this print was known as Het Persianti, the Little Persian, because the man's clothing was perceived as having Oriental features. However, this is not genuine Iranian costume, although Rembrandt loves to lavish attention on different fabrics and furs. This isn't anything original or anything that an actual Persian man would have worn. It's an imaginary pieced together outfit. Rembrandt's interest in texture can also be seen with Old Man with Beard, Fur Cap, and Velvet Cloak from 1632. So again, you know, we see hair, rich velvet, and thick fur, and he's done such wonderful things with all of the lines that we can really feel all of those different textures. This is the second Oriental Head from 1635. This work is part of a series of etchings traditionally called the Four Oriental Heads. Rembrandt didn't etch them from life, but rather after prints his Leiden friend and colleague Jan Levens made around 1631. This is the part that I like, because I like when Rembrandt is snarky. He did not do this simply because he admired Levens' work. On 3 of the 4 prints, Rembrandt noted that he had geretoucheerd them, which means in Dutch to both adapt and improve. So he thought he was improving on Jan Levens' work here. My personal favorite in our collection is the Pancake Woman from 1635. Rembrandt recorded this scene which he observed in his street, and with such conviction you can really put yourself into the shoes of all of these individuals. We see the eager boy in the back who's digging in his pocket for a coin, the weary, hunched over Pancake Woman who's already worked for a full day. The little toddler in the front is one of my favorites, with chunky little legs running away with a pancake in his hand. This one has such a feeling of all of the people who gathered on the Dutch street, and there's such a sense of immediacy and movement. I really love this one. So he does a lot of biblical scenes, as we've seen. This is Joseph telling his dreams from 1638. This is a story from the Old Testament. This is Genesis 37:1 through 44:9. And quote, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.'" And so this is another great moment for observing how Rembrandt does faces and different textures. And he's really created an intimate scene here with all of this very delicate cross hatching in the back. We also have Clement de Younga, which is one that we've seen before. This is his friend and print dealer who inherited Rembrandt's copper plates when the artist passed away. And the last print that we have in our collection is The Blindness of Tobit from 1651. The Book of Tobit is a book of scripture that falls between Malachi and Judith in the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canons. This book was removed from the Protestant Bible. So it tells the story of Tobit and his family who are living in Nineveh after Sargon II deported the northern tribes of Israel to Assyria in 721 BC. Tobit is blinded by bird droppings on him after sleeping outside, which leads him to falsely accuse his wife Anna of stealing a goat. So here we see blind Tobit kind of reaching for the wall. And I love the sensitivity that we have here. We have Tobit's little dog who actually looks like he's about to trip his master. And Tobit's shadow reflected on the wall. We can see like his chair by the fire behind him. And he's knocked over his spinning wheel. So he manages to put so much in this, pretty sparse, light etching. And I think he just does a really beautiful job of evoking Tobit's humanity and how he's suffering through this blindness. So while none of these works are in 125, they are absolutely stunning. I had so much fun researching this talk and getting to spend some time with Rembrandt. As some of you know, the 17th century is my favorite century, and it was my area of, of academic expertise. So this was a lot of fun to be able to spend some more time in it. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let me bop us all out of screen share for the moment. And I am happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And if you don't want to ask them now, certainly feel free to shoot me an email about them. But does anyone have anything? Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Kate, for being here tonight and sharing this with us. I was wondering if we know if Rembrandt found the process of etching a plate just to be a tedious chore, or did he enjoy doing that, and the being able to do several prints off of a plate was just the frosting on the cake for him?
From everything I've read, he really did enjoy the process, especially because it's much harder to alter a painting. Once you've created a painting, that's pretty much what the painting looks like. And so I think he really appreciated the freedom of, it's kind of going in and erasing, but you can do so much more with like a finished etched plate than you can a finished painting. And he certainly altered his paintings. But I think printmaking really allowed him freedom to change his compositions and, change the light and shadow in a way that painting could not.
Thank you.
He, like most artists, always wanted to tinker. He always wanted to go in and improve things and try something different. So I think printmaking really allowed him space to do tinkering, where you could, try it one way and see how that looked, and then you could keep improving and changing and tweaking it.
Well, we have visited his house in Amsterdam, and I didn't know much about him, and I still don't know anywhere near as much as you do. But what impressed me at the time was how much of a businessman he was.
Mm-hmm.
Having the art school there upstairs and handling and displaying the works of other artists, plus his own work, he was a very busy man.
Mm-hmm. And that's something, I'm not an artist myself, but in that period, an artist had to be. There wasn't a gallery system that existed as it does today. There weren't even really museums in the 17th century. So for an artist to support himself, he had to have numerous income streams, and that was a really smart way to do it. Like, you had students and you were selling your art and you'd bring in other people's art to sell. So yeah, it was a real business proposition that you kind of had to be on top of. Anyone else? All right. Well, it's been lovely to have everyone. Certainly feel free to reach out if you have any other questions about this. I'd be happy to answer them. But other than that, it's been lovely to have you guys here. And I hope everyone's enjoyed seeing this particular corner of my living room for the last 30 or so minutes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lovely to have everyone.
It's very informative. Thank you very much.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, you guys. It was so much fun.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
Do they have a way to know how many people are watching?
I don't know. Let me see here.